Last month, the Culinary Workers Union in Nevada rejected supporting Bernie Sanders as a presidential candidate because of his Medicare for All. And if that were to be passed, that would mean that their members would lose the premium health care that the union has fought for many, many years. In fact, on the morning of the Nevada primary, the union was sending text messages to members encouraging them literally to vote for anyone but Bernie Sanders. However, when the Nevada primary was held, the rank and file members actually voted for Sanders in a huge majority. Those who bucked the union leadership explained themselves in very plain moral language. While they appreciate having premium health care coverage, they are aware that keeping a system in place that gives some people great coverage while leaving millions of others without care is morally reprehensible. One of the arguments against Medicare for All is that if everyone had health coverage, it would overwhelm our health system. That is, the 30 million people that have no coverage would suddenly start trying to see a doctor, and we just can't have that. They were willing to give up their enviable status if it would also mean that their relatives, their neighbors, their friends who were sick would have access to health care, or could at least receive basic health care. This, at least in my mind, becomes the major dividing line between conservatives and progressives, between the right wing of politics and religion, the right wing of our economic system and everything associated with it, and those that are on the left. There is the fear and greed-based perspective of, I've got mine, I've earned it, I deserve it, you can't have it, you can go ahead and die, but I'm going to keep what I've got. I don't make that sound very nice, but you get what I mean. And again, from my perspective, the progressive view is that our whole society is connected to one another, that we are willing as individual members of that society to make some personal sacrifice in order to benefit the whole of society. This is becoming crystal clear in the healthcare universe as COVID-19 virus goes from being a problem in China to being a problem that will threaten the entire global population. There is no containment of a virus like this. It will travel the globe. And though it is presently quite rare here in the Midwest, it's on its way. My hope is that in the next months there will be a vaccine developed that will prevent people from getting it in the future. But the point about Medicare for All is we are all better off if everyone, the rich and the poor, the insured and the uninsured, the old and the young, get a vaccine or get health care. That if we continue to say those who are lucky enough to be employed where they have good insurance or wealthy enough to have good insurance, if we can keep them healthy, but their neighbors and their servants, the people that cook for them and clean for them, the people who work for them in lower compensated positions, they get sick, then they are going to keep reinfecting everybody else. Look, they're not closing down daycare centers and elementary schools because children are specifically at risk of dying from COVID-19. They're closing them down because crowded schools become incubators for a virus that the kids will share with their parents and grandparents, especially their gray-bearded, overweight, pre-diabetic grandparents who are expected to die from this virus in fairly large numbers. And it isn't, I'm afraid that many young people are saying, well, I'm young and healthy. If I get it, I'll be really, really sick for 2 weeks, and then I get over it, and then I don't get it again. That isn't necessarily how this is going to go. People who get it oftentimes end up with double pneumonia. They can have enough damage to their lungs that they could spend 3, 4, 5 months in physical therapy trying to recover, and for the rest of their lives not be able to participate in sports or active events. The COVID virus will run its course in a couple of weeks, but it may do physical damage, even to young people, that will last for the rest of their lives. So if you've got a double-digit IQ, which excludes most of the people that work in the White House, but if you've got a double-digit IQ, you realize that your instinctual fear, we all automatically say, I don't want to get sick. But you've got to realize that even in your best interest, I also don't want my neighbors to get sick. Because if we do not want to keep multiplying this virus and spreading it to more and more vulnerable people, we have to start caring about everyone. And even the whole issue of testing that has been delayed, our White House refused to accept tests that were made available by the World Health Organization because they thought if we don't test, then we don't diagnose and we keep our numbers down. And now that the tests are being made available, they're being made available to people for as much as $500 a test. And so who's not going to get the test? The people that are cooking your food, the people that are sweeping your floors, the people that are doing the lower paying jobs, they can't afford to get it. If we don't make the test universally available for free, then what we are doing is deciding we're going to keep spreading this lethal virus into the foreseeable future. Now, I got to tell you, I haven't always been hip to this. I've been guilty of choosing to not get the flu vaccine in years past because I'm 63 years old. I've never had a sick day. I have never taken a day off work. That doesn't mean I never get sick. It just means that I never get sick enough to not go to work. But what that also means is that I have unknown number of times been carrying a flu virus that I was shedding and spreading to you good people and other folks because I didn't want to get a flu shot. Well, I get them now. I have realized that even though I'm not afraid of getting the flu, I also need to be afraid of not giving the flu to anybody else. When you are deciding whether or not to get the flu shot, people, please hear me. It isn't always about you. Everything isn't about you. You get vaccines to protect your family, your bridge partner, your employees, and your neighbors. This really isn't that hard. We want to prevent sickness from being spread around our society. You don't just think about yourself. If I may be allowed to really dig deep for an illustration, and this is deep. Most of us can remember the really silly, irredeemably silly 1960s TV series, Gilligan's Island. That this TV show managed to last for 3 seasons may be a part of why space aliens refuse to communicate with Earthlings. But I remember this one episode in which the 7 stranded castaways who'd been trying to get off the island for years, they found an inflatable life raft that had washed ashore. Finally, they were going to be saved. But alas, earlier in this same episode, they had discovered gold on the island, and they had all been mining and hoarding gold. But they knew that they had to limit the weight on the boat. But when they all got on the boat, every one of them had disguised in their personal possessions their hoard of gold. And as soon as they cast off, other than Gilligan, guileless Gilligan was innocent, but the entire boat sank within seconds of starting to cast off. This, for me, is a metaphor of how our economy works. If we think only of ourselves without equal regard for others, because people in this world, we are all in the same boat. We are all in this together. And if we are greedy and fearful, we will sink the entire globe. I admittedly don't use Bible verses in our services very often anymore, and I'm not going to wander in too deeply into what Paul was thinking when he wrote this text, but I love the way he says this. that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. There is suffering that's just a part of the world. Natural disasters, aging, a worldwide epidemic. There's also suffering that is a result of human evil, such as war or poverty or slavery. But there is also a kind of suffering that we theologians call redemptive suffering. It's suffering that you endure by choice. That's the kind of suffering where you choose to suffer in order to accomplish a noble goal. That's the kind of suffering that, when it's chosen for the greater good, that can produce endurance, that builds character, and with depth of character comes a reasonable hope for the future. Now, this past week, we remembered the anniversary of Bloody Sunday in 1965, when black demonstrators on a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to demand voting rights, were set upon by the state police, their deputies. They turned police dogs on the crowd, beating some of them and shooting others. There were people that were shot and killed by deputies that day. Congressmember John Lewis was just 25 years old the day of the march, and in his own words, Lewis said, "I have been beaten, my skull fractured, I was arrested more than 40 times, so that each and every person has the right to register to vote. Friends of mine gave their lives. Do your part. Get out there and vote like you've never voted before." But here's what I believe needs to be said about this. Before those black Southerners ventured out on the bridge, they had met for days in area churches, being trained, praying together, singing together, literally signing pledges that said that when they were beaten, that they would not hit back, that they were not going to participate in this demonstration if they couldn't decide that they were going to suffer and just absorb the suffering for the cause. Because what they knew, what Alabama white officials didn't seem to grasp, was that when America, through TV news reports, saw the police beating defenseless marchers who were not being violent, who were not fighting back, that it would change the way that white Americans felt about the cause of civil rights. If the marchers had crossed that bridge and had an open conflict with the police, it would have literally frightened white America that watched it on TV in 1965. It would have looked like lawlessness, like being like the beginning of the race war that much of white America had feared since the beginning of slavery. Or I don't know if you guys know this, but the Second Amendment that allows everyone to have guns, that was a concession to slaveholders. The only reason they did that is people like George Washington had a family of 6 or 7 family members that were white and 200 slaves, and they wanted to arm themselves against the slave revolt. The only reason we have a Second Amendment is to keep black slaves from attacking their white overlords. Why we still have it is inexplicable, but that's why it was in the Constitution. But what John Lewis knew, what Martin Luther King Jr. knew, was that if they were seen to be peacefully protesting, but being treated unjustly, violently, that they were literally suffering for the redemption of their people. Now, David Ketchum and I were recently participating in a demonstration that was in favor of impeaching Donald Trump. It took place on Springfield's most busy intersection, at the intersection of Glenstone and Battlefield. Trump supporters would roll down their windows and shout obscenities at the gathered demonstrators, and the people all around us would shout obscenities right back. So we kept moving, trying to find a place where we could oppose Donald Trump without being associated with people who were acting like Donald Trump. What good does it do to object to his lack of character if we become just as debased and morally corrupt as he is? We've talked about David doing a series of sermons or classes specifically aimed at teaching all of us how to participate nonviolently in protest movements. You may wonder why I don't teach the class, but I assume if you're wondering that, you haven't paid much attention to who I am. But that's another issue, isn't it? Let me ask you also to consider the case of Nelson Mandela. Though Mandela was heralded as a hero of the end of apartheid in South Africa, for most of his life, he was on America's terrorist watch list. He was a Marxist, and though he had personally been nonviolent, he maintained that black South Africans had a right to pursue their freedom through militant action if it became necessary. He was involved in the ANC, the African National Congress, and was an active revolutionary in trying to bring down the apartheid government. So he was arrested in 1962 for his anti-government work, and he was sent to prison for the next 27 years. 27 years, 18 of which was spent on a rock in the sea, Robben Island. Prisoners worked on Robben Island in the blinding sun in temperatures that were daily over 100 degrees. He was provided with a bucket to keep in his cell as his latrine. He was rarely allowed a visitor. He was not allowed to exchange mail or to have access to the news. Yet he could have been released at any time in those 27 years if he had been willing to swear off the use of violence as a means of protest. He didn't know if anybody was noticing that he was in prison. He had very little contact with the outside world. He could only hope that by choosing to suffer under the heavy hand of the racist government of South Africa, that he was drawing worldwide attention to the plight of black South Africans. And the American government supported the white minority government of South Africa right up into the 1990s. He only knew from whispers that there was a free Mandela movement. 27 years. I'm going to ask you to forgive me for making this comparison. But when Mandela was freed in 1990, I made the observation to my congregation that the church speaks voluminously about the crucifixion of Jesus, which was admittedly a torturous death. And maybe it's wrong for me to say this, but the suffering of Jesus was over in a day. Mandela spent 27 years in a cell doing hard labor in blinding, blistering heat, to the point that when he came out, he had to wear sunglasses inside. He was so sensitive that even light fixtures would affect him. Literally pooping in a bucket and wondering if it all would ever end. 27 years of elected suffering for the plight of his people. Check yourselves. I don't think I could have done it for a month. I'm not sure I'd have made it a week. But he came out of that cell to accept the Nobel Peace Prize and to become not only the first black president of South Africa, but the very first president elected by the entirety of the population. First time they let black people vote. He served only one term, then devoted the rest of his life to eradicating poverty and HIV from Africa. Now, South Africa still has serious problems, but the fact that apartheid was ended without a bloody civil war is due in large part to the fact that Mandela was willing to suffer for his people and in the end to work with his white oppressors to turn the nation over to the majority population in a democratic government. Look, folks, when those demonstrators gathered in Selma to pray and be trained in how to peacefully demonstrate for their rights, those days of preparation were all about conquering fear. They knew that there would be police dogs when they started their march. They knew there would be horseback state policemen breaking their skulls with their billy clubs. but they chose to take the risk only because they had together worked towards overcoming fear. Because they had let go of their fear, they were able to suffer the blows, the humiliation, and the risk of their own death in order to claim their human rights. Nelson Mandela spent years protesting, being arrested, writing articles, and testifying for his people until the day came when he too had to go to prison. And he had little kids. He was married to a crazy woman, but he was married. And he could have made a decision that he wanted to spend his adult life with his family, raising his own kids. But he managed to have principles that were greater than the fear that any one of us would have felt. Every day he perfected his character, and I'm not even ashamed to say perfected his sainthood in the sweltering heat, in the stench of his own sewage in a bucket in his cell, suffering for the redemption of his people. Now, when I outlined this sermon a few months ago, there was no such thing as COVID-19, and talk about the coronavirus was a distant concern for China. Now we have 2 cases of diagnosed COVID-19 in Springfield. There's at least 1 more in Kansas City. And this was the toilet paper aisle in Target on Wednesday night of this week. COVID-19 is a respiratory infection. It does not cause diarrhea. And unless you were planning on swabbing out the inside of your lungs with toilet paper, what was this about? What were people doing? What has driven the hoarding of soap, hand sanitizer, and toilet paper? You can't even buy a thermometer. I mean, the things you really do need to know whether you're coming down with the virus. People, how many thermometers can you use at once? But they are all gone because people, out of fear, are overbuying. They are stockpiling without concern for what happens to their neighbors. Now, something's going to happen. If the coming spring weather does not dispose of COVID-19 the way we might hope, it's going to spread. Estimates are that between 50% and 70% of our own population is going to get it. Most people will feel ill for a week or 2, and they'll eventually be fine. Some people, especially those of us who are older, who have underlying health conditions, we are in danger of dying or being disabled. If it does not go away with spring weather, there is a real likelihood that even in our little city, there could be 3,000 or 4,000 people who will die. How are we going to act in a worst-case scenario? If our hospitals are full and most of our healthcare workers are infected and sick, how are we going to act? Let's decide now, before it spreads. Let's decide right now. When you can't go to the hospital because all the beds are taken, when you can't contact your doctor because your doctor is sick, what are you going to do? Now, I have to confess that what I've seen up to today is not encouraging. The globe, America, Missouri, Springfield, is going to be tested. Hard times, scarcity, fear, reveals where the demons are hiding, but it can also reveal our better angels. This is one of the things that Viktor Frankl talked about being in the Nazi death camps, that Freud had predicted that under the right stressful circumstances, everyone becomes demonic. But Freud didn't live long enough to see those death camps. In the death camps, angels were also revealed. When the hard times come to us, when we're squeezed, what's going to come out? I love the way that my idol and role model for preaching, John Stewart, said it. If you don't stick to your values when they're being tested, they're not values, they're hobbies. We have been practicing our whole lives for a moment just like this. So let's refuse to be afraid. Let's refuse to think only of ourselves. And let's show this damn virus who we really are.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.